Hello, I'm Verity Barr, Head of Brand Communications at Cavendish, and I'm joined here today by independent brand strategist Alice Woods. Over the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to talk about how today's polarised world is impacting brands. The rise in populist political movements right across Europe and North America has given licence to extremists to declare their views. Social media platforms are increasingly giving a voice to opinion formers and influencers from right across the political and social spectrum. Battle lines are being drawn and culture wars are being fought on a daily basis around issues that until recently would have been considered kind of critical to living in a fair world. And brands are getting caught in the crossfire. Politicians and consumers alike are targeting some of our biggest and best known brands for the stances that they're taking on political, environmental and social issues. And more than ever, corporate leaders are facing a really fundamental decision. Do they stay true to the commitments and values that they've declared, or do they wheel back and change direction in response to these pressures that they're facing? As well as Alice, who we're going to be talking to today, earlier this week I spoke to Charlie Rowley, a political commentator and former Ministerial special advisor, and Tony Diver, who's the associate political editor at the Telegraph. And together we're going to be exploring where the balance of power lies in these culture wars and why it's so important for brands to remain authentic in this changing world. So to kick us off, Alice, and just give us a bit of context, I wonder if you can talk to us about why having values is so important to brands and why staying authentic to those values is so critical.
Yeah, thank you, Verity. Well, I think whether a brand sort of likes it or not, they have a personality, and that personality is gleaned from those values that they live by. That might mean that they've invested in a brand and they have a lovely strategy and they have 5 pillars up on the wall of the office that they try and live by, or it's just simply how they actually conduct and do their business. But either way, consumers are more savvy than ever and they're looking out for how businesses are operating. And as they have more choices around them, it's impacting more how they buy, because that personality comes to them no matter what. I think as well, it's no longer a case of kind of big brands having a monopoly and you kind of have no choice. You know, even if you go to the milk aisle, it used to be you were sent to the shop for a pint of milk and that was it. But now you look at all the choices that we have, these indie brands, challengers, B2C buying options coming from all angles. But I think with having more choice, this means that consumers are kind of forced into more critical thinking, whether they like it or not. So either they're following trends that they're seeing or, bucking a trend as the case may be. And they're no longer kind of blindly buying. And I think as well, it's fair to say that consumers can really see through the kind of the marketing speak now. They're much more savvy. And if a brand is kind of being inauthentic, it soon becomes clear. We've seen many times where a brand has kind of been caught out, and the internet is quite quick to judge, and it does move fast, so they will get exposed. So I think in today's kind of era of mass information, more consumer knowledge, a brand simply kind of has to live by its values if it wants to kind of attract that audience that shares them. And I think as well, at the end of the day, we can argue the nuances of it, but, capitalism is political. So as long as we operate under that, we have to accept that, brands and politics are going to be kind of forever interlinked.
And in the face of that, because I think you make a really important point there about the breadth of consumer choice now, and so therefore the opportunities that consumers have to flip between brands or kind of change their buying decisions. Kind of in the face of that, do you think that it's right for some brands to have pulled back so quickly from some of the big commitments and really big statements that they'd made?
Well, I think whether it's morally right or wrong is kind of a question for each brand. And although it probably feels like a step backwards to many of us for DE&I, that is still kind of so desperately needed to create equality and equity in sort of today's society, as well as just diversity of thought and why it's important for creativity and things like that. I think actually in some ways a positive can be taken from it, because those brands that were just doing as a tick box exercise, they've kind of been forced to show their true colours. And although that might be easy for us to say here, it's not so easy if you're a worker at Walmart or even in the government itself, and you've seen a programme that you've been part of that's been helping you along the way in terms of getting that platform of that equity that you deserve. it does allow the consumer now to see brands kind of for who they are, and it allows us to make more truer choices around who we want to kind of align with and support.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point, especially as you said, that picking up on the view of the employee as well. And in fact, something that I asked Charlie when I was speaking to him a couple of days ago was whether he felt that brands even have the right to kind of be arbiters of social value and to make some of those big statements or commitments relating to DE&I or net zero or the other issues around that. So let's take a second to hear what he said.
Yeah, so I think they definitely do. But you've always got to remember that corporates, I think, obviously want to be on the side of government because they'll ultimately want to pay less tax. They'll want to grow their business. They'll want to recruit more people. They'll just want to grow organically and as quickly as possible. So they don't want to do anything that I wouldn't have thought clashes with government. But of course, that's just one element of it in terms of regulation and just growing as a business. But you've got the consumer as well. And so it's working out who is your target audience and at what, and if you're growing your business, what market you need to move into, which then I think forces you to make the decision whether you balance between, right, are we on side with government? Have we gone too far? Here's a market that needs to be tapped into. So let's really tap into that and link it to an event, whether it's an environmental cause or campaign or equality campaign or any other campaign.
So Alice, just picking up on Charlie's point there about brands responding to what customers want, do you think that a brand's response to coming under pressure to change direction really should boil down to their understanding of their customer base and what their customers actually want?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, your audience are everything and understanding them is always going to be the key to your success. And whilst we've just mentioned that kind of the rollback of those DE&I policies, for example, might seem kind of shocking to us, but I think we also do have to face fact that, as you mentioned at the outset, we are living in an era of much more divisive politics and society. You only have to look at the rise of the right and kind of the dissolution of sort of the centre across Europe and the US to see people are kind of clearly more falling on one side or the other. But then I think if you look at examples, I mean, the classic really is Ben and Jerry's, versus Unilever, how a company has really stood up for the values that they built their business on, because that is how they brought their audience with them. And they've really taken a clear stance on that. And it's been probably at the detriment of their, their business in some ways, but it's really doubled down on who their audience are. Then if you look at, for example, in the UK, the Co-op, they asked their shareholders about the sale of Israeli goods in their stores, and the shareholders voted to cease those sales. So that's a really clear example of standing up, taking a stance, listening to your audience and actually doing what the audience wants. But it's not always so easy for brands. People are trying to make sales, they're trying to keep everyone happy, they're trying to keep shareholders happy. So sometimes it's like, who is your audience? Is it the people on the ground? Is it the shareholders? And it's finding that balance.
And I think it's really easy to see, particularly through those couple of examples that you just gave us there, of where the commitments are absolutely true to a brand and its values and what it stands for. It feels really natural for them to stand up for them and stand up for those rights and those beliefs. But something else that I went on to ask Charlie was kind of the flip side of that. And actually, if this kind of era of, inverted commas, woke capitalism is actually just giving some brands an opportunity to kind of flip back to what they actually believed in the first place, or a reaction to, or those commitments were kind of a reaction to a trend or a way of thinking at the time that they made them.
That'll be the leadership from the very top. If if the managers and senior directors there have a particular cause and still want to, and are known historically for, I think, supporting a particular cause or being in a particular field or campaign network, then I think they will see that as a badge of honour, that they're challenging government, that they're challenging the status quo, that they're trying to shift the dial amongst the public whilst using their brand that might be quite iconic. So they're in a very strong position to do that. I think if it's a brand or an organisation that is suddenly and dramatically changing, that appears to be either jumping on the back of something or feeling it feels unauthentic, that the company is changing its branding, or it's now saying things that it hasn't said before. All of a sudden, it's just ditching something. I think that's when the consumers, much like the public in political terms, they can smell a rat, or they know when something's not quite right, and you lose a bit of confidence in your consumer base.
I think that point Charlie made, I think we're going to say the same thing, that point that Charlie made about authenticity is like really key here. And actually, is this really an opportunity for some brands to have a kind of natural reset back to anti-woke values that were perhaps more authentic to their brand in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, you know, he was talking about when you're in a strong position. I think that's really key. You know, if you think about, it's a little bit easier to be ethical and make the right choices when, you know, it's not the cheap option, is it? You know, they say no ethical consumption under capitalism, and it's very difficult to make those choices. And I think we generally a lot of us are trying to make good choices, and, you know, we want to do what's right for the environment and all these things, but everyone's under pressure, the cost of living crisis, you know. So when times are hard, your motivation for what you're purchasing is a little bit different for when, you know, the going's good. You might say, oh yeah, I'll go for this one that's more fair trade, or they have like really clear sustainability goals that I can, you know, trace back, and there's a transparency there. But when you're trying to feed a family of 4, it's like, actually, I just have to go for the cheapest thing, and it's the lesser of two evils at that point. And I think, you know, Amazon is like the prime example of a moral dilemma that we all face day to day. You know, we might want to do the right thing, but the convenience and the cheapness a lot of the time does overshadow what we kind of know is going on. You know, that there's been so many memes and things around like the Bezos wedding, and people are saying, oh, I'm washing out my yogurt pots and recycling them while 500 private jets are flying into Venice, but you might have bought those yogurt pots on Amazon. So it's a really difficult decision for consumers as well as brands. I think a lot of people want to do the right thing, but it's not always easy. But I think as well, you have to think about, you know, there are these trends, you know, everyone kind of jumped on this green or sustainability, and it's a sad thing to say that sustainability should be a trend. And, you know, a lot of the brands that I'm working with now no longer want to add sustainability as a value. You know, a few years ago, that was like, okay, one of our core values is green, environmental sustainability. And a lot of the brands now are saying, well, no, it should just be inherent. And we don't want to say that that's something special that we're doing, because it should just be something that's natural. And then we're also in an era of greenwashing, and there's so much kind of, you know, snake oil in the industry that it's really hard for consumers to know who's actually doing the right thing, because you can slap something on your pack, and as long as you just about get away with it, you know, so it's more difficult for consumers to kind of differentiate as well. So and I think as well that it's then some brands are kind of going back, just reverting back and sort of taking it away, because they weren't really doing it in the first place anyway.
So this is almost giving brands an opportunity to be more transparent.
Yeah.
And actually for some consumers that will be respected and again help drive their affiliation to a brand, because they now understand exactly what the brand stands for, rather than feeling like they may be being kind of pushed in a particular direction or
or hoodwinked a little bit. And I think if you look at someone like Brewdog, for example, they really sold themselves on being these kind of rebels and punks and doing things differently, and, you know, they were B Corp certified and all this, and that's what their whole, that wasn't just something that they did, that was their whole kind of personality and their whole kind of value kind of proposition to the consumer. But then it kind of all came crashing down. You know, they were called up on their environmental credentials, they were under scrutiny for their ethics at the workplace, they faced a real backlash when they kind of went into partnership with the World Cup in Qatar, and they, you know, people were saying it's kind of at odds with your values. And that kind of all comes kind of crashing down, and those values that they once built their company up with became the sticks that people could beat them with. So it's like it really went against them, because they built their company on something, and then when it was found out that it was inauthentic, that was kind of their downfall. And I mean, don't quote me, but I think they haven't been profitable in years now, and, you know, okay, they've got like a bad reputation, and it just goes to show that if you're going to do these things, if you're going to stand up and say these things, either just don't do it or really be true to it. You have to be authentic, and that's where that authenticity really comes into play.
Yeah, so true. Just changing tack slightly, I wanted to get Charlie to lean into his political experience and kind of his knowledge and depth of working in the political world. And so the next question I asked him was to get his view on whether he thinks that some politicians are purposefully making statements that could be extreme or pushing brands in a certain direction simply because they want to get to a group of potential voters who they believe will agree with that, who are maybe feeling disenfranchised at the moment, but that if they can appeal to them, they might just be able to provide enough votes to kind of swing success for that party. So let's hear what he had to say on that point.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think opposition parties will be more alive to that and take part in that a lot more than I think the government of the day, because the government obviously has a lot more responsibilities. And if it says something that's market sensitive or wants to attack a particular brand, then of course all things can happen. And you're the ones that are carrying the can for the responsibility of the economy and at large. And nobody wants to wake up in government to headlines that push back from however many businesses because of something you've said. So there's slightly more caution in government. But you're absolutely right. I think if you're an opposition political party and you are trying to attract a voter base that that you can tap into through populism, and whether it's a culture war or a divisive point of contention within public debate, and you sort of want to use some companies as an example that might be playing up to those issues, like net zero, or working from home, or offices with sort of spending too much time on things like making sure everybody's got their pronouns on their signature at the bottom of an email, or it's gender neutral toilets, things that don't really necessarily have to come up in public life. All of these things can be squared off quite easily, but because there is a steady drumbeat of dissatisfaction, I think, in Britain currently, for lots of different reasons, for failures for all governments, not just this one, but certainly the last one over a number of years. There are lots of unhappy people out there. And so if you're an opposition party that can play on those fears and unhappinesses, if that's a word, and also use examples of companies to back up your claim why you need to change the country, then of course you're going to, I think, hit some companies over the head, and some companies will be hit and therefore feel as though that they've got to move or change their dynamic. Because if it is, for example, reform, and if it's net zero that they're very big on scrapping, if they are doing as well as they are in the polls in a few years' time when it comes to a general election, they've certainly done very well in the council elections, you can imagine there'll be a number of companies that were previously very supportive of net zero and environment, maybe sort of dialing that down a little bit to focus on where they think the public attitudes may be, because polling in politics can also be used for big brands and companies. So they will take that polling, they'll look at what voters are thinking and what the national mood is, and how they shift their brand and advertising accordingly to hoover up that consumer base.
So Alice, do you think brands are simply caught in the political crossfire, or do you think Charlie's really got a point, that last point that he made there, that actually this is about, again, just really understanding your customer base?
Yeah, I do think it is that, and I'm sure. I mean, when we say are brands caught in the crossfire, I mean, they are, in the sense that I think probably most brands and organisations out there are feeling the effects of recent budget cuts or tariff changes in the US. I would say if you did a straw poll of most across the UK and the US, they would say, well, the government's policies and things are affecting us, and that's because the economy it's a tricky time. But I think it's about scale as well. If you're someone like Unilever versus like an indie brand, your priorities and allegiances are going to be probably very different anyway. But like I say, everyone is probably facing those kind of cuts. And I think if, we do have to remember that whilst big organisations may want to kind of be in the pocket of government. I think it can go both ways as well, because often a big corporation might actually have a little bit more influence on public favour than the government of the day or even the opposition. It's not just a one-way street. If we look at the historical kind of lobbying of like big pharma or tobacco companies, or there's been quite a furore about organisations who were Tory donors who then got NHS contracts, all these things. So I think it is really kind of a two-way street, but I think we do have to remember that they do actually have quite a big influence on each other, and brands can't, they are kind of the arbiters of like the zeitgeist, and that's what people are moving with. You only have to look at Diane Abbott drinking an M&S gin in a tin on the tube, and then Rishi Sunak wearing the Adidas Sambas. Like, the public favour went in two opposite ways for those, because one was seen as cool and one was seen as not cool, or whatever way you kind of fall. But it does go to show how big of an influence something like that can be. I don't think Rishi and Adidas were in cahoots, but by him wearing those, it made a big splash. So I think there is influence, but I do think it's a two-way street, and I think brands have just as much power, if not more. And at the end of the day, they're not they're not voted into power. They can influence people in different ways. So I don't know if they're caught in the crossfire, or we're just in this kind of battle zone all together and everyone's kind of a player.
And of course, there's a third big player in that battle zone, the media, something that we haven't really touched on yet. Yeah. When I was chatting to Tony, as I said, political editor at the Telegraph, so really well placed right at the heart of this culture war discourse. One of the things I asked him was, as a political journalist, how does he see the media's role in all of this? So let's take a listen to what he said.
I think it kind of depends on the situation as to who leads that debate, whether it's the media or politicians or brands. I don't think we have an especially kind of activist media in the UK. Certainly when you compare to some of the American media, which takes a lot of a harder stance on a lot of this stuff, the American right-wing media can be, is really seeking out and being kind of vicious to these organisations. I don't think we have that so much in the UK. I think what you do see, though, is brands that make it a part of their brand identity to have a stance on things. If you look at Ben & Jerry's, for instance, Lush is another one which has had a sort of very deliberate stance on a lot of issues. And so, when brands do that, clearly it creates a bit of public discourse and interest, and perhaps they're doing that because they're trying to appeal to a certain kind of audience. And politicians on the opposing side then react to it. I really think that us as the media, we kind of stand in the middle and watch, and perhaps sometimes we help it along a little bit by calling up the politicians that we know are going to be annoyed about it and asking them. But really, I think those kind of tensions are there, and what happens is the media sort of speculates and then puts together a story. And when you've got a situation where there's a kind of well-known brand that the readers will know about, and then politicians that they perhaps are interested in, whether they agree with them or not, that is grounds for a very compelling story, I think.
So Alice, as a strategist and a strategy advisor, when you're talking to brands about culture wars and kind of directions that they need to go in, like, how much store do you place on the media and the media's role in all of this, and the media as an audience for brands?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. He mentioned that the media stand in the middle, and I do agree that the US media are much more politically minded or polarised, but I think in the UK it is becoming more obvious, even if it's more subtly implied. For example, the BBC have just been called out about censorship and things like that. If you voted for Corbyn, you probably read The Guardian. It's not as overt maybe, but I think it is, that impartiality is kind of dissolving. And of course, we're just talking about traditional media here, but as the media landscape kind of evolves and mutates, there's an influencer in Birmingham that has probably given news to more people than maybe some newspaper over here. So it's quite difficult, but I think where it does come into play still is where brands are buying their media, or where PRs are, pitching the story. So it's not maybe a decision that's kind of laid bare for the audience, but you are subtly understanding that if you see something, if you're a company in Liverpool, you're probably not going to advertise in the Sun, are you? People aren't going to buy it. So I think people, brands are still kind of drawing their lines, and kind of where they're buying their media is kind of who they're aligning with, because at the end of the day, it's the age-old thing of who's the audience and that who's buying it, what demographic are they, and those things still exist. That's kind of the old model, but it is still the model that works. So I think whilst you may not see the working out or that decision making, if a brand is aligning itself or placing media in one of these more traditional medias, or if they're working with a certain influencer who's probably less impartial and probably has made their views a little bit clearer, I think you are going to see those more political and cultural kind of allegiances, depending on where they're aligning with.
And it sounds like it's coming back to that same point, which is becoming a bit of a theme here, which really the key in all of this for brands is to really understand their audience and their customers and what they believe, and either mirror that or kind of echo that in some way.
Yeah, and I think as brands are becoming, as we said, there's less of kind of a monopoly. It's not just going to buy milk and bread and cheese in the shop anymore. You've got this plethora of choices, and I think especially as these kind of indie brands come up, they have much more of a free rein and a license to kind of really take this stance, and they really have to be authentic. Like they have to lay themselves bare a little bit more than maybe the big monopoly brands that you just say, oh, well, I'll buy that washing up liquid because I always have. But when these new brands are coming up, these challengers, unless they really set their stall out and say, this is what we're about, this is who we're for, and this is what we're going to do for the world, then it's going to be really hard to make an impact. So I actually think authenticity is becoming more and more important. And sometimes I do laugh when we put down in a tone of voice like authentic. Well, why would you be inauthentic? It shouldn't be, you have to just be you. So I think we're actually moving past authenticity and more into this really clear personality or opinion, or it's more about a point of view. The authenticity should be inherent. Yeah. And it's like authenticity is often associated with being good or but you can be authentically bad in someone's view, depending on your different views. So I think we've moved past authenticity, and it's really about now having a very strong point of view.
Yeah,
and the audience do.
Yeah, and that tone of voice point is really interesting, and actually leads me to a bit of a tangent that I took Tony down. But being a kind of old school PR, I love language. And I think it's so noticeable that around cultural wars, so much of the language that's used through media reporting, but also through us having conversations, almost has a kind of military connotation. It's all very aggressive language and aggressively reported. And we talk about wars and warriors and fights and battles. So I wanted to get Tony's take as a professional wordsmith, whether that is a kind of purposeful decision by journalists to take us down that road. So let's hear what you had to say on that.
I don't know where the phrase culture war came from, but I think it is a useful one in that it encapsulates quite a lot of debates on different topics, which all emerged at roughly the same time, not very long ago, and then went on very quickly to become big parts of public discourse. And those are about gender identity, for instance, about the environment, about a kind of slightly sort of American leftist intellectual understanding of the world and where power is, which then became a sort of dominant narrative of power in public institutions in the US and the UK very fast. And that led to further debates about DEI and how it's implemented and how money is spent and all that kind of thing. Those are not easy topics to describe in short news stories, which are getting to the heart of whatever it is that's happened that day. And so I think culture wars is a quite convenient shorthand to say, this is the kind of story we're writing about here. We're writing about those debates that you will have read about before, and this is another one. As for the use of the term war, I think that is just journalists describing people who have different ideas about things. It's not the only subject that journalists talk about there being a war or a battle. We write Keir Starmer is in a fierce battle with his MPs over welfare reforms or whatever it is, the story of that day. the news speaks in a language of battles and wars and fights because it's more interesting to read than heated policy debate or however else you describe it otherwise. I don't think the language of culture wars from the journalist side is especially more kind of inflammatory than any other subject, although clearly it is a subject in which activists and campaigners have kind of gone to new levels in terms of how vitriolic their disputes can have been.
Before we come back and kind of have a chat about what he said, I want to go straight into the next question that I asked him, which kind of leads on from that very war-focused language that as he said, kind of makes for a good story, really. Just led me to ask him whether he thinks that the media are simply a platform for kind of sharing discussion and debate about culture wars, or whether it's a bit more than that and they're actually catalysing the debate as well and kind of elevating it. So let's just hear what he said on that, and then we'll come back to you, Alice.
It's kind of a discussion that happens within the sphere of public debate as opposed to something which is affecting your everyday life in terms of how much money you spend or how much tax you pay or whatever. So yeah, I think the media is where people find out about these discussions, and it does catalyze those discussions, not necessarily in a bad way, but in a way which introduces people to new ideas and the arguments that people are making and the stances that people are taking, be them in the corporate world or in Westminster or wherever. So yeah, I think as with any kind of emerging debate, the media has done a lot to catalyze those discussions. I think the reason that happens is because when we write about this stuff, it's what people want to read. And of course, when that happens, you write about it more. You show people the discussions that they're interested in hearing about. And meanwhile, politicians who want to get involved in that will find a platform in those places because, news organisations want to tell their readers what they're interested in hearing about.
So Alice, for a kind of final question. Yeah. So clearly we've got a situation where we've got politicians who are potentially pushing brands to do something for their own political gain. We've also got a media who are reporting all of this in a way that they want to make, I hesitate to say entertaining to read, but something that will appeal to their readers. So it could all feel like really negative for brands at the moment. But how can brands kind of counter this sort of onslaught of negativity? How can they kind of use their voice for kind of good, or to give us a bit of light relief in all of this as well, perhaps?
Well, I think just to touch on the language part first, he used the word catalyst, but I think that's quite a soft word actually for what's happening, not to speak to his publication specifically, but in general, as kind of traditional media kind of dissolves, at the end of the day, we're in this very kind of fast-paced, dopamine-fueled kind of stratosphere, and it's like clickbait sells, essentially, doesn't it? Society's becoming more divisive. You mentioned the notion of kind of gender identity, and that has become a war, whereas trans people have kind of always existed, but now they're sort of being weaponized. It's not like a new phenomenon, but they've been catapulted into this culture war. The same as kind of immigration debates and all these things. And I think media and politicians, and I'm going to widely generalize here, but they know that, the more kind of fiery and aggressive the language, the more kind of divisive the ideas they put forward, the more people are going to get involved, they're going to get angrier, which means they're going to comment, they're going to share, they're going to click, they're going to like, and rack up the views. And unfortunately, that kind of, ammunition is engagement, and that becomes the currency, and that is the news and media landscape we're in. That's what sells now. So, people would also probably argue that politics, these issues are being used to distract us from kind of the wider things. And if you're too busy fighting your neighbour next door, then you're not going to be too worried about a policy that's being rushed through or something like that. And I think actually this is, all this is happening, and that is the negative side of things. And as I say, I have generalised there, but I think actually now what we're seeing in brand world is that we're kind of, there was quite a big era of this very poignant sort of storytelling, and everyone wanted to do these really cinematic ads and things like that. And actually I think we're coming back to a bit of an era of humour, and more brands are using that, and we're seeing that more in the ads, and we're kind of gone past the tearjerker John Lewis, and we're maybe just reverting back to kind of just a bit of silliness and lightness. And actually I think that is where brands obviously not every brand can be silly and light, but even if you look at some, you know, life insurance brands or mortgage brands or even funeral care, they're bringing like a lightness back into things, and I think actually that's where their real opportunity can be, in terms of it's not their job to galvanise the population or to entertain us, but I think it's actually where they can really win now, because the world at large is very depressed and it can be, you know, really drag us down. So I think brands can take this opportunity and actually bring a bit of like fun and happiness and joy back into society.
That feels like a really nice note to end on, Alice.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's not all doom and gloom.
Yeah.
Well, look, thank you for sharing your views, and thanks also to Charlie and Tony, who, as I said, joined me earlier this week, for sharing their thoughts and opinions as well. We hope that you found the conversation interesting, and if you've got any thoughts or comments on culture wars and the impact that it's having on brands and the role of brands, both in terms of kind of responding to those culture wars, but also, as Alice said at the end there, you know, maybe providing a little bit of relief in difficult times, then please do get in touch with us. You can find out more about us at cavendishconsulting.com.